In the latest escalation between Caracas, Port of Spain, and Washington, the government of Nicolás Maduro has announced the suspension of major energy cooperation agreements with neighboring Trinidad and Tobago, citing what it describes as hostile actions by the island nation aligned with a growing U.S. military posture in the southern Caribbean. At the heart of the dispute is the arrival on Sunday of the U.S.-guided missile destroyer USS Gravely, DDG-107, in Port of Spain for joint naval exercises with Trinidad and Tobago's defense forces. The ship's proximity, lying within range of Venezuela's near neighbor shores, has triggered a vehement reaction in Caracas. President Maduro, addressing the nation on Monday evening, pointed directly at Trinidad and Tobago and its Prime Minister Nicolás Maduro, accusing the country of being an active participant in a larger U.S. strategic operation against Venezuela. He declared that his government was exercising what he described as a precautionary measure, namely the immediate suspension of all energy agreements with Trinidad and Tobago. Specifically, Caracas is shutting down a gas supply accord and joint exploration initiatives that had long been part of the two countries' energy cooperation. Among the key projects is the so-called Dragon gas field, estimated to hold approximately 4.2 trillion cubic feet of gas and situated just across the maritime border from Trinidad's Atlantic LNG complex. Oil Minister and Vice President Delcy Rodriguez characterized the bilateral relationship as hostile, accusing Trinidad of aligning with U.S. sanctions and energy licenses that exclude Venezuela's role. Her remarks set the formal request to Maduro's presidency to suspend the 2015 agreement underlying the gas field cooperation. From Trinidad's perspective, Prime Minister Prasad Bisesar responded that her country's future does not depend on Venezuela and never has, making clear that her government is pursuing its broader energy and economic agenda independently of its neighbor. The military dimension beyond the energy rift, the episode is deeply enmeshed in a broader regional tilt. Washington's expanding naval and air operations in the Caribbean have triggered alarm in Caracas that Venezuela is being encircled or squeezed. According to multiple sources, the U.S. has deployed a flotilla of warships, including the forthcoming arrival of the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78, in what the U.S. frames as an anti-drug trafficking campaign. Venezuela says these operations are not merely about narcotics, but signal an attempt to provoke regime change. In recent weeks, U.S. military assets, bombers, drones, destroyers, have operated in Venezuelan-adjacent waters. For example, 2 US B-1B bombers flew parallel to Venezuela's coast last week. Allegations of a false flag plot. In a further twist, Venezuela has claimed that it uncovered and dismantled a covert cell, allegedly financed by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, that was plotting a false flag attack on the USS Gravely with the aim of blaming the Venezuelan government and triggering a military confrontation. Vice President Rodriguez declared, the Prime Minister of Trinidad has decided to join the warmongering agenda of the United States. Foreign Minister Ivan Gil Pinto also issued a statement. On our territory, a criminal cell financed by the CIA and linked to this covert operation is being dismantled. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello said 4 people have been arrested in connection with the alleged plot, though no further details were provided. While the claim is serious and raises profound implications for regional security, independent verification remains thin, and neither the US nor Trinidad and Tobago governments have publicly confirmed the allegations. Why this matters? The crisis layers energy, naval power, regional alliances, and covert intelligence operations into a volatile mix. For Venezuela, economic survival remains tied to its oil and gas exports. Interrupting energy ties with Trinidad can be seen as both symbol and substance in its broader geopolitical pushback. For Trinidad and Tobago, hosting the US warship and aligning more closely with Washington could offer enhanced security cooperation, but at the cost of inflaming tensions with its immediate neighbor, Venezuela. For the US, the region is becoming a frontline in its anti-drug and counter-trafficking strategy, but also a theater where power projection could trigger a wider confrontation. Detailed timeline and background. Sunday, 26 October 2025. USS Gravely docks in Port of Spain and begins joint exercises with Trinidad's defense forces. Venezuela describes the move as a provocation aimed at provoking a war in the Caribbean. Monday, the Venezuelan government publicly announces suspension of all energy cooperation with Trinidad and Tobago. President Maduro accuses Port of Spain of serving as the aircraft carrier of the American empire against Venezuela. At the same time, Venezuelan officials claim they have seized a CIA-financed cell plotting a false flag attack on the US warship. The government does not publish supporting evidence, raising questions among analysts about the underlying veracity of the claims. In recent weeks, the US has launched at least 10 strikes on maritime vessels in the Caribbean that it alleges were involved in drug trafficking, killing dozens of people, though Washington has faced scrutiny over the legal basis and transparency of the operations. Key quotes, verbatim, "The Prime Minister of Trinidad has decided to join the warmongering agenda of the United States." Delcy Rodriguez, "On our territory, a criminal cell financed by the CIA and linked to this covert operation is being dismantled." Ivan Gil, "Our future does not depend on Venezuela and never has. We have our plans and projects to grow our economy, both within the energy and non-energy sectors." Kamla Persad Bisesar. Regional and economic consequences. The suspension of energy ties threatens the already fragile economic blueprint between the two countries. Trinidad and Tobago is highly reliant on natural gas, 92.6% of its energy supply, and had been counting on joint developments with Venezuela to sustain its LNG industry. For Venezuela, the freeze in cooperation signals another step toward economic isolation amid US sanctions and a struggling domestic economy. Security dimension. Venezuela's coast lies just 11 kilometers, 7 miles from Trinidad at its narrowest point, proximity that amplifies the significance of any military hardware in the area. The presence of the US destroyer so close to Venezuelan shores converted what might otherwise have been routine exercises into a flashpoint. The accusation of a false flag attack adds yet another layer of tension. If proven, it would imply a clandestine operation designed to trigger conflict under false pretenses, a scenario with dangerous precedents. Analysts highlight the historical parallel of false flag operations, whereby incidents are staged to justify intervention. Legal and diplomatic questions. Observers have raised questions about the legality of US strikes on maritime vessels claimed to be drug traffickers, citing insufficient evidence and lack of transparency. The Caribbean deployment of US naval power and intelligence operations is being viewed by many regional leaders as a challenge to sovereignty and non-intervention norms. Outlook and implications. For now, the standoff remains diplomatic with threats and counter-threats. However, the combination of suspended energy ties, naval presence, intelligence allegations, and bilateral breakdown raises the risk of miscalculation. Venezuela may feel pressured to respond more assertively. Trinidad and Tobago must weigh its alliance decisions alongside regional stability. The US will face scrutiny both domestically and internationally over the legality and strategic implications of its operations. What began as a docking of a US Navy destroyer in Port of Spain has rippled into a broader confrontation involving energy policy, intelligence Cold War-style allegations, and regional security dynamics. President Maduro, facing an increasingly hostile neighborhood and mounting domestic challenges, is using bold steps to signal defiance. While Washington and its regional partners view the build-up as part of a drug trafficking crackdown, Venezuela frames it as the prelude to regime change. In this high-stakes context, the suspension of the energy deals is more than just a contract dispute. It is a symbolic and practical escalation in the Caribbean's new great power chessboard.